They said the Imperial Crown Hotel was where gods disguised themselves as men, where power gathered under chandeliers that looked like frozen constellations. Tonight, it was a palace of glass and gold, every surface reflecting wealth so immense it could blind the unprepared. Waiters glided like shadows, violins whispered in the corner, and laughter rang sharp as crystal breaking. In the middle of it all, a young woman moved with a tray balanced on her palm. Her name was Hoa Karen. To most of the glittering crowd, she was invisible. To the few who noticed, she was only a servant. But beneath the plain uniform, beneath the silence, something dangerous slept. The ballroom pulsed with arrogance. Men in tuxedos sipped champagne as if it were water. Women in gowns worth more than houses tilted their heads in synchronized disdain. A politician's wife sneered when Karen passed, her pearls gleaming like little moons against her throat. "Look at her shoes," she whispered to her friend, not bothering to lower her voice. "Do they sell them at thrift stores?" The friend giggled behind a manicured hand, her eyes sliding down Karen's modest flats, as if they were an insult. Karen did not flinch. She did not answer. Her tray remained steady, but her fingers pressed just hard enough against the silver to feel its bite. Across the hall, laughter erupted around one man. Victor Harrington, billionaire industrialist, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that magazines pretended meant destiny. Wherever he went, space bent toward him. Tonight, he held court, his velvet voice carrying across the orchestra's hum. When Karen passed near his circle, Victor's gaze hooked her like a fish caught mid-swim. He smiled, sharp and cruel. "Do you even know how to dance?" he called out, loud enough to hush conversations around him. "Or is serving drinks your only rhythm?" The table roared. Glasses clinked in mock applause. Clara Beaumont, his companion in a blood-red gown, leaned forward, lips curling. "Yes, let her show us," she purred. One step before she stumbles. Karen paused for only a fraction of a heartbeat. Her face revealed nothing, but her chest tightened as if the air itself had turned to glass. Every eye in the ballroom swung toward her. She was no longer invisible. She was prey surrounded by wolves. A young tech magnate, watch glittering like new money, jeered. "Come on, entertain us. That's what the help is for, isn't it?" The orchestra faltered. A violinist missed a note, strings whining like nerves pulled too tight. The hush that followed was worse than laughter. Karen stood alone, tray in her hands, the weight of 100 gazes pressing down, waiting for her to bow, to vanish, to confirm their belief that she did not belong. But Hoa Karen did not move. Her silence thickened, sharper than any reply. The tray lowered, deliberate, to the nearest table. A soundless declaration. Something in the air shifted. The night was no longer theirs, it was hers. Victor Harrington's smirk widened, as if Karen's silence was exactly the reaction he craved. He tugged at one of his white gloves, a gesture that felt archaic, theatrical, and let it fall from his fingers. The glove drifted through the air before landing at Karen's feet with a soft thud that echoed louder than thunder. The crowd leaned in, phones tilted upward. A ring of anticipation closed around her like a noose. "Pick it up," Victor commanded. "Show us you're good for something more than refilling glasses." His words slithered over polished marble, amplified by the hush of expectation. Karen bent slowly, every movement precise. Her fingers brushed the glove, lifting it as though she held a blade rather than cloth. When she straightened, her eyes locked onto Victor's, calm, sharp, defiant. "If you want to dance," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "at least keep the rhythm right." Gasps sliced through the room, a servant talking back it was unheard of. Clara Beaumont's laugh rang out too loudly, brittle, and furious. "How charming," she sneered. "The waitress has teeth." The orchestra hesitated, glancing at each other, bows hovering over strings. Then, almost against their will, they began a tentative waltz. The violins trembled, the piano entered uncertainly, like music written for disaster. Victor strode forward, seizing Karen's hand before she could retreat. His grip was iron, not an invitation, but a cage. "Then dance," he growled. He spun her hard, too hard, forcing her body into imbalance, hoping the marble would swallow her dignity in a single fall. Gasps turned to cruel laughter. Look at her stumble! A man in a pinstripe suit shouted. Clara clapped gleefully, her red nails flashing. She's drowning already! Karen's tray was gone, her apron forgotten. In its place was silence wrapped around her like armor. She exhaled once, eyes shuttered, feet searching, and then she found it. The rhythm. It welcomed her like an old friend she had sworn she'd never see again. Her next step was not a stumble. It was a claim. She moved, her body aligning with the music so seamlessly that Victor's aggression looked clumsy beside her. His attempt to force her into mistakes only revealed his own lack of grace. She shifted weight, redirected his hand, and suddenly she was no longer following. She was leading. The room's laughter faltered. The clinking of glasses stilled. The hush grew deeper, stunned, reverent. Impossible, Clara hissed under her breath. Yet her eyes betrayed the first flicker of doubt. Karen's movements grew sharper, deliberate, a language of control spoken through every turn of her wrist, every glide of her step. Victor tried to resist, but resistance only tangled him further. He was a puppet, dragged along by invisible strings, his smirk melting into a grimace. A journalist near the edge of the crowd lifted her camera, snapping furiously. The shutter clicks became a heartbeat, capturing a story no one had expected. Who is she? Murmured a guest in a sequin gown. Victor's circle shifted uncomfortably, their jeers collapsing into uneasy silence. They had come for mockery. Instead, they were witnessing something else, something dangerous. The music swelled, Karen pivoted, her plain shoes striking marble like a declaration. She looked like no waitress. She looked like fire contained in flesh. Still, not everyone was ready to surrender. Clara, face taut with fury, slid from her chair and crossed to the orchestra. She bent low to the conductor, slipping a folded bill into his hand. Play something harder, she whispered fiercely. Let's see her choke. The conductor hesitated, then raised his baton. The waltz died mid-measure. A tango burst to life sharp, demanding, merciless. The crowd gasped at the shift. Victor's grin returned, sweat shining at his temple. Now, he said, tightening his grip on Karen. Let's see you fall. The spotlight contracted, trapping her in a circle of white fire. Cameras turned, the music stabbed at the air, but Hoa Karen did not flinch. Her chest rose once, steady. Her eyes glimmered with something fierce, something unbroken. And when the first brutal beat struck, she moved like a blade unsheathed, ready to cut through every doubt in the room. The tango slashed through the ballroom like a storm. Violins shrieked, cellos thundered, the rhythm merciless, designed to break even seasoned dancers. Victor lunged, sweat dripping at his temple, forcing steps meant to dominate. But against Hoa Karen, his movements looked clumsy, desperate. She didn't resist his aggression, she redirected it, guiding his arm, twisting his weight, making his every effort collapse back onto himself. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Karen spun, her body slicing through the air, her plain shoes gliding with impossible precision. Each beat she struck was a blade, sharp, flawless. Victor's smirk vanished, replaced by a grimace of strain. He was no longer leading, he was barely keeping up. Clara Beaumont's nails dug into the conductor's stand, her eyes wild. No, she hissed under her breath. Make it harder. But the music had already taken on a life of its own. It bent toward Karen, not against her. The crowd murmured, their voices a tide. Who is she? Whispered a man in a pearl gray tuxedo. How does she move like that? A woman in emerald earrings gasped, clutching her husband's arm. The laughter that had filled the ballroom minutes earlier was gone, smothered beneath something else, wonder, disbelief, fear. At the edge of the room, an older man rose slowly from his chair. His hair was silver, his tie crooked, his eyes sharp with memory. He leaned forward, whispering to the woman beside him. That's no waitress, he said, voice heavy with awe. That's Hoa Karen, the Phoenix. The woman's hand flew to her mouth. She had heard the name before. Everyone had, once. The Phoenix, the champion, who had vanished years ago, swallowed by silence. The whisper spread like fire in dry grass. The Phoenix. Hoa Karen, a name resurrected. Within seconds, it was everywhere, hushed, reverent, trembling. The audience began to shift, leaning closer, trying to reconcile the woman in a plain black uniform with the legend they had once read about in glossy magazines and watched in glittering stadiums. Victor stumbled again. Karen tightened her grip, then released, leaving him spinning off balance. He caught himself with a snarl, panting, face crimson. "You," he began, but the word drowned beneath the swell of applause that erupted mid-dance. Karen didn't hear the whispers. She didn't see the recognition spreading like a fever. Her focus was absolute. She was no longer in the Imperial Crown ballroom. She was back in the studios of Paris, the bright lights of Tokyo, the packed arenas of London. Every step remembered, every rhythm rising from the ashes she thought she had buried forever. She moved as though her body had been waiting for this moment. The tango bent to her will, the crowd forgotten, Victor irrelevant. This was not performance. This was reclamation. Near the bar, a young journalist scribbled furiously into her notepad, her pen trembling. She elbowed the photographer beside her. "Do you see this? Are you getting this?" The man nodded, lens trained on Karen, capturing every pivot, every leap. "This will go viral," he muttered, his voice shaky with awe. Still, denial clung to some like armor. A guest in a pinstripe suit barked, "She's showing off. Just a servant with luck." But even as his voice cracked, his eyes betrayed him fixed, unwilling to look away. Clara, face pale with fury, rose from her seat. "No!" she shouted, her voice sharp enough to slice. "She's nobody. A servant cannot be the phoenix." But the room no longer listened. Victor wrenched free, staggering back, wiping sweat from his brow. Then dance alone. He spat, retreating into the shadows of his own humiliation. Karen did not hesitate. She turned toward the spotlight, alone now. The orchestra's strings surged, the rhythm daring her to falter. But she leapt forward, her body bending, twisting, spinning with fire. Not flawless elegance, but something wilder, deeper. Each step declared not just survival but return. The audience erupted again, some clapping, some crying, phones flashing, and through the noise, the name pulsed like a heartbeat. The Phoenix. The Phoenix. The Phoenix. The spotlight narrowed, enclosing Hoa Karen in a circle of white fire. Alone now, without Victor's clumsy weight, she became something else entirely. The orchestra stabbed the tango's fiercest notes into the air, daring her to fail, daring her to break. But Karen's body did not falter. It answered the challenge with fluid fire, a storm of precision and abandon that stunned the hall into breathless silence. Every turn of her wrist, every sharp heel strike on marble, was defiance made flesh. She was not dancing for applause. She was not dancing for them. She was breaking chains, their chains, her own. For a moment, the ballroom itself seemed to lean toward her. Waiters frozen at the edges stared wide-eyed. Guests who had laughed earlier now sat rigid, transfixed, their jeweled hands clutched nervously in their laps. Yet not all would surrender. From the back, a man with flushed cheeks and a glass of wine shouted, "She's nothing but a stunt, a servant dressed in fire." His words cracked with desperation, but the sound barely touched her. Karen's gaze flicked toward him, only for a heartbeat, and the look was enough to still him. He shrank back into his chair, throat dry, the glass trembling in his hand. Others resisted more quietly. A woman in diamonds hissed to her table, "It must be staged, no waitress moves like that." Yet her eyes betrayed a different truth. Disbelief, shading into awe. Awe shading into fear. Karen's silence was her blade. She said nothing, not a single word. But every step spoke louder than any insult. Her body declared what her lips refused. "I am not what you think I am." The music built to a fever. Karen leapt, spun, landed in a flawless arc that sent a shockwave through the crowd. Applause erupted involuntarily, clashing against the lingering jeers. The room fractured between those still clinging to contempt and those swept helplessly into reverence. Clara Beaumont refused to yield. Her face twisted, her painted lips trembling with rage. She shoved past the guests around her, storming toward the orchestra again. Harder, she hissed, her voice desperate, venomous. Push her past the edge, but the musicians were no longer hers to command. They watched Karen, caught in her gravity, their bows trembling as if drawn by invisible strings. The conductor's baton rose, and instead of sabotage, the music transformed softer, darker, more haunting. Not to break her, but to crown her. Clara's fury curdled into something worse. Fear. Her claws of influence had slipped, her weapon turned against her. She stumbled back into her chair, face pale. The audience leaned forward, caught in the undertow of Karen's performance. Phones lifted higher, streams of comments raced across glowing screens. Who is she? The Phoenix is real. History reborn. Karen's movement slowed, shifting from the furious stabs of tango into something more primal. Ballet blended with jazz, classical with street. Every leap was memory, every spin a resurrection. She was showing them not a performance, but a survival. And then, silence. The orchestra's last note faded like breath in winter air. Karen stood still at the center, chest rising and falling, eyes steady. She had not broken. She had not bowed. For a long heartbeat, nothing. Then the room erupted. Applause crashed against the walls. Some stood, shouting her name. Others sat frozen, faces ghostly, realizing their mockery had turned to ashes in their mouths. But beneath the ovation, beneath the gasps, another current stirred darker, sharper. Because awe could shift into resentment, and not everyone would accept her rebirth. Somewhere in the crowd, whispers hissed. She shouldn't be here. She doesn't belong. Take her down. The chains had broken, but the war was only beginning. The ballroom had become a storm. Applause clashing with whispers, admiration colliding with denial. Phones captured every angle, streams exploding with comments, the world beyond the gilded walls already awakening to Hoa Karen's return. But in the midst of the chaos, a new sound rose, a heavy flicker of screens powering to life. Behind the orchestra, the massive LED backdrop, once displaying the gala's logo, shifted. Static bloomed, then cleared. Grainy footage filled the room, a younger Karen in a leotard, spinning across a stage flooded with light. Her arms carved the air like wings. Her leaps defied gravity. The caption scrolled across the bottom in bold letters once printed in every sports column. Hoa Karen, the Phoenix of Asia, world champion. Gasps detonated. A woman clutched her pearls so tightly they snapped, scattering across the marble. A man dropped his champagne flute, glass shattering against the floor. Recognition surged like fire through the crowd. Victor Harrington froze near the bar, his face bloodless. Clara Beaumont's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. She stared at the footage as though it were a ghost returned to haunt her. Karen stood motionless in the spotlight, eyes lowered, letting the images speak. Every victory, every medal, every ovation she had once received now illuminated the ballroom like judgment. She had never needed to reveal herself. The truth had been waiting. Patient, undeniable. Mr. Langston, the hotel's elusive owner, stepped forward. His presence was quiet yet commanding, his silver hair glinting beneath the chandeliers. When he raised his hand, the room fell into reverent silence. "She is not your entertainment," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, cutting through the frenzy like a blade. "She is our new artistic director. She is the Phoenix reborn." Shock thundered through the audience. For a moment, the applause died, replaced by a stunned, heavy quiet. Then the dam broke, cheers erupting louder than before, reporters surging forward, microphones lifted like weapons of worship. Clara staggered to her feet, fury twisting her face. "No, this is a trick," she shrieked. "She's nobody, just a servant pretending to be someone she isn't." Her voice cracked, desperate. "You're all being fooled." But her words drowned in the tide. Every camera pointed at Karen, every lens drinking in the calm woman who had stood against humiliation and emerged as fire. At that moment, the ballroom doors opened with a soft click that carried more weight than thunder. A tall figure entered. Daniel Wynn, Karen's husband. His suit was dark, simple, yet the gravity of his presence shifted the air. He didn't need to announce himself. His reputation walked ahead of him. Executives paled, politicians averted their eyes. Daniel moved without hurry, without force, until he stood beside Karen. He touched her elbow lightly, a gesture almost invisible, but it silenced the last of the jeers. He didn't look at Victor. He didn't need to. His calm was heavier than threat, his silence louder than Clara's screams. The crowd parted as though instinctively bowing. Some turned their faces away in shame, recalling their laughter minutes earlier. Others raised their phones higher, knowing history was crystallizing in that instant. Victor tried to recover. He forced a laugh, hollow, trembling. Enough spectacle. Back to serving drinks, Karen. His words broke on the air, weak, pathetic. No one laughed with him. Karen finally lifted her head. Her gaze swept the room past the chandeliers, past the cameras, past every jeweled mask of arrogance. She said nothing. But the way she stood straight-backed, unflinching, with Daniel at her side was the verdict. The truth could no longer be denied. The phoenix had risen, and the world was watching. The Imperial Crown ballroom did not return to normal. It could not. The air itself had changed, heavy with realization, with shame, with awe. Applause still echoed, cameras still flashed, but beneath the glittering frenzy another truth had taken root. The wolves had been unmasked, and their prey had become their judge. Victor Harrington stood stiff near the bar, his jaw locked, his glass empty but clenched as though it could anchor him against the storm. Yet nothing could save him. Overnight, footage of his mockery spread across every corner of the internet. By morning, shareholders demanded accountability. Within a week, his resignation was announced, phrased delicately as stepping back from public duties. But everyone knew it for what it was, a fall. Clara Beaumont fared no better. The video of her laughter, her shrill jeers, the moment she spat, "She's nobody," was replayed millions of times. Her carefully curated social media dissolved under the weight of comments, not insults, but mirrors. Screenshots, timestamps, her cruelty laid bare. Invitations dried up. Brands cut ties. She vanished from the spotlight she had once clawed for, leaving only silence and shame. Others who had laughed that night found themselves swept by the same tide. The tech magnate with the glittering watch lost his largest investor after his drunken chuckles went viral. The woman in diamonds discovered her phone stopped ringing, her name quietly erased from guest lists. The punishment was not theatrical, not immediate. It was quieter, heavier, like doors closing one by one until the world they had ruled no longer welcomed them. But Karen did not stay to witness their collapse. She had no need. When the music ended, when Daniel's steady hand found her elbow, she folded her apron neatly on the nearest table, placed her tray beside it, and walked out of the ballroom. The cameras followed, but she did not look back. Her silence was her crown. Outside, the city air felt sharper, cleaner. The crowd parted as she stepped into the night, Daniel at her side. Some clapped, others lifted their phones, but most simply watched in reverence, their faces lit by the glow of screens recording history. A young girl, daughter of a caterer working overtime, stood at the edge, eyes wide, clutching her mother's hand. She whispered, trembling with awe, "She's like a queen." Karen's gaze caught hers. For the first time that night, she smiled, not for the crowd, not for the cameras, but for the child who saw her not as a servant or a spectacle, but as something possible. She nodded once, a quiet promise. "You too can rise." The days that followed belonged to the world. Articles dissected her past, her victories, her disappearance. Commentators debated her silence, why she had walked away, why she had returned in such fire. Videos of her dance filled timelines, not just as entertainment, but as testament. To some, she was inspiration. To others, rebuke. But to all, she was undeniable. In the quiet of her home, Karen did not read the headlines. She did not replay the footage. Instead, she worked. Her new office at the hotel filled with sketches, stage designs, notes for performances yet to come. She poured herself into creation, not explanation. Yet sometimes, when she passed a mirror, she would pause. For an instant, she would see not the waitress, not the director, but the girl who once stood in a leotard, her coach's gravel voice echoing, "You're not just dancing, you're telling the world who you are." That night in the ballroom, she had told them, not with words, not with speeches, but with fire. And the world had listened. The proud had fallen. The phoenix had risen. And Hoa Karen walked forward, unshaken, into her own tomorrow. The world moved on quickly, as it always does, but the memory of that night refused to fade. The Imperial Crown Gala was supposed to be a monument to wealth and vanity. Instead, it became the stage where a forgotten legend burned her name back into the world. For weeks, the story of Hoa Karen filled timelines, headlines, and whispered conversations in cafes. But behind the noise, beyond the viral clips, something deeper lingered: the image of a woman standing tall in her plain uniform, refusing to bow, refusing to be small. Karen did not return to the spotlight in the way people expected. She did not chase interviews or bask in adoration. She poured her energy into work rehearsals, stage design, nurturing young dancers who had once believed greatness belonged only to the privileged. She understood something few did. Her victory was not in reclaiming fame, but in reclaiming herself. Still, the echoes of that night reached far. A janitor in Manila replayed her video during midnight breaks, whispering to himself, "If she can rise, so can I." A single mother in Warsaw shared the clip with her daughter, saying, "Remember, you're never less than anyone else." A factory worker in Detroit, mocked by his supervisors, wrote Karen's name on the inside of his locker as a reminder. Dignity cannot be bought or erased. The Phoenix was no longer just a dancer. She had become a mirror. For those who had been dismissed, ignored, or reduced to their lowest label, her story rang like a bell through stone corridors. It told them that silence could be strength, that grace could be sharper than cruelty, and that identity could not be dictated by ridicule. Karen herself rarely spoke about that night, but sometimes, late at rehearsals, when the studio was empty and moonlight spilled across the mirrors, she would dance not for an audience, not for applause, but for herself. The rhythm was no longer a burden or a battlefield. It was freedom. And in those moments, she knew the truth. She had never danced for their approval. She had always danced to remember who she was. The proud had fallen, yes. But the greater lesson was not their collapse. It was her rise. Because every person in that ballroom, every person watching on their screens, learned a truth they could not bury. Respect cannot be demanded through wealth. It is commanded through dignity. And dignity shines brightest when tested in fire. So if you too have felt the sting of laughter, the weight of being overlooked, the chains of mockery, remember Hoa Karen. Remember the plain black uniform, the steady hands, the silence that spoke louder than cruelty. Remember how she turned humiliation into a stage, how she led those who tried to break her, how she walked away without looking back. The Phoenix rose not because the world welcomed her, but because she refused to remain in ashes. And so the message is this: you do not need their approval to know your worth. You do not need their applause to justify your fire. The world will try to bury you beneath doubt, beneath ridicule, beneath silence, but the flame within you is yours alone. Guard it, feed it, let it rise. Because somewhere, someone is watching, perhaps a child, perhaps a stranger waiting for proof that they too can stand. Be that proof. Live as that fire. For every one of us who has been laughed at, overlooked, or diminished, this story is not just Karen's, it is ours. And it whispers the same truth across every ballroom, every workplace, every street. You are not small. You are not forgotten. You are more than they imagine. Rise. Always rise.